What's going to be the difference between LSU quarterback Garrett Nussmeier potentially falling back into those gunslinger tendencies and ultimately becoming one of the best quarterbacks in all of college football? I think there's four main things that we'll break down on today's edition of Locked On LSU.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
All right, what's up, y'all? Welcome into Locked On LSU. Thank you for making us your first listen every single day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And also remember that you can check us out on YouTube as well. Just hit that subscribe button, and then you'll get notified as soon as new episodes of the podcast drop. Today's edition of Locked On LSU is brought to you by Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little bit further? Ever wonder what adventure could be around the next corner? Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Check them out today at nissanusa.com. All right, let's get into it because it is a changing of the guards in LSU football. Garrett Nussmeier takes over for Jayden Daniels. And look, it's big shoes to fill. Jayden Daniels, Heisman Trophy winning quarterback this past season, but Garrett Nussmeier has been patiently waiting his turn and waiting first initially behind Miles Brennan. Then Jayden Daniels came in. Jayden Daniels took over the starting spot. Now it's Garrett Nussmeier's time to shine. But we know just like Jayden Daniels had his areas that he needed to improve upon going into his first season, and of course, after his first season, going into his second season, we knew that Garrett Nussmeier had some things that needed to be fine tuned. Now, a few of those things, Garrett Nussmeier known as the gunslinger, where you have really high highs and really low lows with the gunslinger like that. Like, yeah, you have the kind of quarterback that's willing to drop back, take risks, lop it downfield, and trust his receivers to come down with those 50-50 balls, but also the other side of a gunslinger, and look, that is really exciting. And you can move the ball downfield, and you're going to have a lot of really wild plays that way. But like I mentioned, the other side of that is turnovers, putting the ball within harm's way. Now that Garrett Nussmeier is taking over the starting job, he's going to have to fine tune the decision making. As fun as it is to be a gunslinger and as many wow plays as you could potentially make, they're going to have to reel it in when you are now the guy. And that is what Garrett Nussmeier is faced with. Now, what we saw against Wisconsin in the bowl game gave me and probably gave you every single reason to be optimistic. Because it felt like there wasn't a throw that Joe Sloan and Cortez Hankton, now your co-offensive coordinators, asked Garrett Nussmeier to make that he couldn't make. It seemed like any throw, any receiver that Garrett Nussmeier wanted to hit, now he could hit him. There's still a certain level that I don't think that we know about Garrett Nussmeier just because we haven't seen it on a consistent enough basis. We don't have a big enough sample size of Garrett Nussmeier specifically as the starter because we only have one game. And it came against a Wisconsin team in a bowl game that, let's be honest, probably going to see significantly better defenses on a much more frequent basis than you would see in a bowl game. So we still don't know exactly what Garrett Nussmeier is on a week in and week out basis. But what I do know is that Garrett Nussmeier, along with any young or inexperienced or new starting quarterback, because I know that Garrett Nussmeier isn't young. He's a veteran quarterback. I know he's not inexperienced, but he is a first-time starter, a first full-time starter. And that role comes with inherent learning curves. Like that role comes with certain boundaries that you have to get past. It's not just because you've been, sitting as the backup for the last 3 years that all of a sudden you know exactly what it takes to be a starter. I mean, Brian Kelly even said it himself. Look, Garrett would come in, and this is what Brian Kelly said, he would come into practice preparing like the starter because that's what you have to do as a backup. You have to come in with the starter's mentality and prepare like the starter and understand and be prepared to come in at a moment's notice. which is something that Garrett Nussmeier has had to do several times throughout his LSU career. But Brian Kelly admitted, look, even when you do prepare like the starter, even when you are ready at the drop of a hat, it's still a different mental space when it's now you. When you are truly the guy. And you know what? I can understand that. As much as you try to tell yourself to prepare like the starter, you know deep down that you're not. So it is a different mentality. So I think that they're as encouraged as I am about Garrett Nussmeier, because it's not just me. I mean, I look at the Heisman odds that have Garrett Nussmeier with top 5, top 10 odds. I look at all of the anticipation and the previews for college offenses across the country, and LSU is always anticipated to be a top 5, top 10 offense. And part of the reason why is because of Garrett Nussmeier and what he's capable of and the experience that he has. But what are the most important factors for Garrett Nussmeier to go from maybe what he was as a gunslinger to go from being maybe a good starting quarterback to being an elite starting quarterback for the LSU Tigers this season? I think there are 4 things. And I kind of want to rank them from my number one concern, my biggest concern, to the thing that I'm least concerned about. I think one thing that always helps young or inexperienced quarterbacks is a solid run game, is a running back that you can rely on, is a running back that you can fall back on, is a running back that's not going to turn over the football, reliable, always there, can create plays, can find the open holes, and just being that go-to guy, whether it be in the pass game or the run game. Being that go-to check down guy for a young quarterback when that young quarterback's back is against the wall, the panic starts to set in. It's like, oh, phew, okay, my running back's there. LSU's run game is going to look different. It's going to look very different because you don't have Jayden Daniels as your leading rusher. But I'm concerned about the depth in that running back room. Right now, since LSU has just finished up their first week of spring practice, they only had 2 running backs to work with in Caleb Jackson and Josh Williams. So you have a guy going into his second year in college football and then Josh Williams as a 5th-year starter. And I know that LSU's got a bunch of walk-ons in that running back room as well, but let's be honest, those guys aren't going to be your saving grace. That's not going to be Garrett Nussmeier's fallback plan or his security blanket. Is going to be those walk-ons once we get into the middle of the season. No, it's going to be a Caleb Jackson and it's going to be a Josh Williams. But you need more depth than just those 2. Now, I mentioned this on a former podcast that whatever happens with Trey Hawley, who is now undergoing a legal process for an incident that happened just about a month ago, could he be available? Sure, he could be. There's also a very high likelihood that he won't be. There's also a very high likelihood that he will come back too late to be an impactful player for this team if he comes back at all. Now, for his sake, for this team's sake, I hope he is back. But I can't count on that. So while I am really, really excited about Caleb Jackson, the foundation that he built last year, and how I do think that he is just going to absolutely blossom, that Caleb Jackson is going to turn into one of those guys that becomes a household name across the country. One of those guys, one of those just, those prototypical LSU backs. I think that Caleb Jackson could turn into that, and I think that he will. But you still just need more. Going into the season with only 2 running backs, that's not enough. I think 4 is absolute minimum. So while I'm encouraged by the run game, if you're going to have a first-time starter in Garrett Nussmeier, you need more options, you need more depth, and you need more insurance at that position. Because as we all saw last season, running the football is pretty darn important in this league. Running the football is pretty darn important to winning football games. But there are 3 other factors that I think could separate Garrett Nussmeier from being good and Garrett Nussmeier from being great and elite and a Heisman contender. And we will continue that conversation coming up next. All right, I want to tell you about Nissan. So, are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little bit further? Have you ever wondered what adventure could be around the next corner? Well, our friends over at Nissan have a lineup of SUVs with the capabilities to take your adventure to the next level. So check out the 2024 Nissan Rogue. It is perfect for city drives and for great escapes. There's class exclusive Google built in, and it's always updating. It's your always updating assistant to call on for almost anything. If you want to listen to some music, if you need help in the maps, if you want to download an app, you can use your Google built in system. And gone are the days of connecting your phone. The 2024 Rogue is the perfect midsize crossover for your next adventure. Or you can also check out the 2024 Nissan Armada. It will change what you expect from a full size SUV. So picture like a rugged four-wheel drive that can seat up to 8 people in first class and luxury style. You can tow bigger and explore further in the 2024 Armada. Two great options depending on your lifestyle and what you need from your future Nissan. So take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find yourself your next big adventure. Shop nissanusa.com. Again, that is shop nissanusa.com. All right, rolling along here, locked on LSU. Thank you for making us your first listen every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, we're part of the Locked On Network, your team every single day. And Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. And now it's available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every single league. So find Locked On Sports today right now, available on the free Fire TV channels app. All right, rolling along here, Locked On LSU. The 4 factors that I believe could separate Garrett Nussmeier from where he is now to ascending throughout the rest of the season and being that next LSU quarterback in the Heisman conversation. First and foremost, it's a solid go-to running back, whether that's a running back, or running backs, running back by committee, whatever it might be, a solid run game that can just, do the quarterback a solid. A little bit worried about the depth of the running back room where it stands. That might be a position. In fact, I think it should be a position that LSU addresses in the spring transfer portal window. The second thing that I think could not completely, but I think could really help Garrett Nussmeier and could separate him from where he is now to to unlocking that next level or levels. And that's the wide receiving core. And I think that this wide receiving core is so intriguing because there is so much change, because there is so much turnover from year to year. And it's a scary thing for sure. It's a scary thing to go from having Brian Thomas Jr. and Malik Neighbors and 2 of the best wide receivers in all of college football to not having those guys anymore. But I think that is what makes this spring football period so intriguing. And it's because you're looking for those guys who could step up. You're looking for those guys who can fill in that role. And it's a fairly stacked room because you're returning Kyron Lacey and Chris Hilton, 2 guys that showed a lot of promise, that contributed to this offense, but frankly were just kind of pushed down the priority list and pushed down in their number of targets because they were behind the 2 best wide receivers and the best wide receiver duo in all of college football last season. So now that those 2 are the most experienced and have been at LSU for the longest, does one of those 2 or both of them kind of carve their way out to be your 1 and your 2? I think absolutely. And then you look at the new additions in the transfer portal this past season. Everything that I have seen and everything that I have heard about Liberty transfer CJ Daniels has been overwhelmingly positive. That it's just the size, it's the physicality, it's the speed, it's the route running ability. That CJ Daniels has the makings of not just being a starting SEC wide receiver, but being an elite SEC wide receiver. Now, this is a rule of thumb that I have for myself. If you don't want to have it for yourself, you don't have to. I am always very hesitant and apprehensive to put way too many eggs in the basket of a transfer portal player. And that has nothing to do with that player. It's not anti-transfer portal in the slightest. It's just whenever you're bringing in a new player in a new system with new coaches and new players around them, you never know exactly how that's going to click. that I maybe learned my lesson of getting too overly excited about what Denver Harris could potentially do for LSU secondary this past season. And it's not just Denver Harris. That's not me picking on Denver Harris, but it is not just at LSU. What we've seen across all of college football is sometimes the guys that you bring in that are going to pop, sometimes they just don't. Like sometimes the grass isn't always greener at your second stop. Like sometimes it is. Like Logan Diggs and what he did for this offense last season. Hello, Jayden Daniels resurrecting his career transferring from Arizona State to LSU. And you can even look around the SEC, around college football. Keon Coleman, I think, is a great example. Transferring from Michigan State to Florida State. Now Keon Coleman might be a, low first round, high second round pick. So you never know with transfers. Like CJ Daniels could end up being the next Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas, Odell Beckham Jr. Maybe, sure. I'm excited about that. I'm optimistic about that potentially being the case. I can't bank on it, but I am encouraged by not just CJ Daniels, but also Xavier Thomas, the transfer from Mississippi State. And I think that this is the perfect example of not getting too high or too low on a transfer portal player. Because I look at Xavier Thomas, whose numbers didn't jump off the page last year. I think he had just shy of 500 yards, if not right around 500 yards receiving. Not flashy numbers, not one that you would look at just on the box score or just based off of numbers alone and say, wow, like that's great. It not really sexy numbers, but I'm going to give Xavier Thomas the benefit of the doubt of being in a truly horrendous offense. That was football and offensive malpractice from former Mississippi State head coach Zach Arnett for feeding a square peg in a round hole and trying to fit that personnel into a completely different offense from when Zach Arnett took over the Mississippi State football program and shifted in one single year from the air raid to a pro style offense, a little bit more run heavy. Not nearly as pass happy as the air raid offense might be. But maybe that's just what Xavier Thomas is. I don't know, but that's why I'm encouraged. I'm excited to see what he can do. But again, I can't put all of my eggs in that basket. So you've got options and you've got experience and you've got depth at the wide receiver position. And that doesn't even take into account some of these young players that have yet to prove themselves, whether it be a Shelton Sampson. And I do want to get into Shelton Sampson on a later episode this week because Brian Kelly had some pretty telling words about Shelton Sampson and his development. Or whether it be a Kyle Parker or a Landon Ibieta who's been sidelined, whether it's, for redshirting or injury, whatever it might be. Those players show a lot of promise, but haven't proven it yet. Also kind of fall into that category of every reason to be optimistic and excited, but also cannot count on those players to blossom into what we think they could blossom into just because we haven't seen it yet. And that doesn't mean that they can't. That doesn't mean that I don't think that they can or will. It just means whenever you're building our football team, you can't, hope is not a strategy. You can't just say, well, yeah, I think this guy will do this because that's not necessarily always the case. So, wide receivers, I feel encouraged about the options and the targets that Garrett Nussmeier has, but I think it's really up to the receivers of who steps up into that wide receiver 1 and 2 roles. All right, two other things that I want to touch on coming up next. Two other people, position groups that I think are going to just take Garrett Nussmeier to that next level. And we will get into that coming up next. Okay, I want to tell you about FanDuel. I love the FanDuel Sportsbook app, and it is that time of year, March Madness, it's NBA. There's so many great plays to get on with the FanDuel Sportsbook app. So say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tournament. Whether you're betting on a big upset or it's a 1 seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Again, that is $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who is going to win it all. So just visit fanduel.com/locked on and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Again, that's fanduel.com/locked on. All right, rolling along here, locked on LSU. Thank you for making us your first listen every single day. We are free and available. We are free and available wherever you get your podcast. Rolling along here on what could be the difference makers for Garrett Nussmeier. Your running backs, your run game in general, your wide receivers. It's a new group, but it's still a group I think you should feel encouraged about. There are two things that are much less of question marks for me that I think are massive game changers for Garrett Nussmeier and also really game changers for this offense as a whole. I'll start with the coaching side of things. When it comes to quarterback development, when it comes to a player not just developing from now until the beginning of the season, but continuing to develop throughout the season from week to week to week, getting better by week 5 than you were in week 1, so on and so forth. That falls on the offensive coordinator. Like that falls on the coaching staff. That falls on Joe Sloan. And I know that Cortez Hankton is the co-offensive coordinator and he plays a massive part in the passing game. But Joe Sloan, I think, is the one coach that I want to zero in on here because he was the quarterback's coach. Because he's been coaching Garrett Nussmeier. Because he is largely responsible for shaping the Garrett Nussmeier that we saw against Wisconsin versus maybe the Garrett Nussmeier that we saw in 2022 in the SEC championship game against Georgia. While he made some really wow plays and fun plays against Georgia, he also turned the ball over. And he looked like a much more polished starting quarterback against Wisconsin than maybe we saw previously. Joe Sloan has a lot to do with that. I would give him credit for that. He is, in fact, the quarterback's coach. And it's kind of along the same lines as the offensive coordinator is he needs to know, as in Joe Sloan, needs to know what Garrett Nussmeier likes. Like, what are his preferences? And it's not just, oh, you want to run on this down and distance and pass on this down and distance. No. It's formations. It's identifying coverages. What makes Garrett Nussmeier comfortable? And those are things that I think Joe Sloan probably does know in being his quarterback coach, which makes me feel encouraged because it's not like you're bringing some offensive coordinator in from the outside that has no idea what makes Garrett Nussmeier tick, what he likes, what he doesn't like, his tendencies. Joe Sloan knows those things and can call plays accordingly. He's familiar with Garrett Nussmeier. And he's also familiar with the rest of this offense. That doesn't just come down to what does Garrett Nussmeier like. It's also knowing those receivers and those running backs, knowing the rest of the offense. And of course, I don't want to just single out Joe Sloan. Cortez Hankton is a massive part of this as well. But knowing the tendencies and knowing what to call is incredibly important. The second thing that I feel really encouraged about, and it's not just about Garrett Nussmeier, it's the thing that helps me sleep at night, knowing that you lost 3 of the best offensive players in the country in Jayden Daniels, Malik Neighbors, and Brian Thomas. Just think about that. Kind of experienced something similar, not the same. It was much worse in 2020 than it is now. But think about how much you lost. I mean, you lost your starting quarterback who won the Heisman Trophy. You lost your 2 leading receivers. And I know Jamar Chase didn't leave for the NFL draft after the 2019 season, but he still opted out of the 2020 season. So it's kind of like you did lose him. But you lost Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson, who weren't just the 2 best receivers in all of college football at the time. They also are 2 of the best receivers in the NFL. You lost your starting running back. You lost several pieces on the offensive line. I mean, offensively, essentially, you were depleted. So the next season, it looks so good that, hey, continuity matters. Who'd have thunk? The one thing that encourages me that this offense isn't just going to, fall off a cliff. It's the offensive coordinator, of course, but it's also the offensive line. That continuity on the offensive line is so critically important. And not even just continuity, but being good up front, protecting the quarterbacks, opening up holes for the run game. As unsexy of a position as talking about offensive line can be at times, it is the backbone of everything that you do offensively. Can't protect the quarterback? Well, sorry, can't pass. Can't run block? Well, sorry, you don't have a run game. You could only you pass protect for 2.5 seconds. Well, your quarterback's going to be on the ground and you're probably going to get him hurt. It is the foundation that you do. It is the foundation of everything that you do offensively. And LSU has an All-American or future All-American at left tackle, a future first-round pick in Will Campbell, a future NFL right tackle in Emory Jones. And then you bring back your 2 starting guards who will also be drafted in this upcoming draft in Garrett Dellinger and Miles Frazier. You lose Charles Turner to the NFL draft, but you're plugging in DJ Chester into that position, who's been at LSU for the last 2 seasons, who knows the rest of these offensive linemen. It's not like you're just pulling someone out of nowhere and you're like, here, build chemistry with the quarterback and build chemistry with the rest of the O-line. There's so much continuity at that position. So even when there's rotation and changes at quarterback and running back and receiver, you have so much continuity. I don't want to say where it matters because it all matters, but you have continuity at a really important position. That if those guys up front can just block and do their jobs, well, that's already a whole lot of your offensive boxes that are already checked. But from there, it's on Garrett Nussmeier. Take care of the football. Make plays. Get the ball into the hands of your playmakers. The offensive line can't do that, but they can give you time. That's going to do it for me today. Thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcast. Coming up on tomorrow's edition of Locked On LSU, Brian Smith, Locked On's official recruiting insider, will stop by and he'll break down the latest on what he's heard in LSU and SEC recruiting. Plus, LSU had such a massive weekend of recruiting last weekend. Some of the top talent in the country was in Baton Rouge. What Brian Smith has heard from those 4s and 5 stars that made their way to LSU this past weekend. All that coming up on tomorrow's edition of Locked On LSU.